An older, unassuming nurse moves through the chaotic emergency room, a phantom in worn-out scrubs, her quiet competence a stark contrast to the barely controlled panic around her. When a critically injured VIP arrives and the arrogant head surgeon's by-the-book methods fail, she is forced to make a choice. Let a man die to protect her peaceful, anonymous life, or reveal the lethal skills she learned on a battlefield she has spent a decade trying to forget. Her insubordination will save his life, but will it cost her everything she has left? The air in the emergency department was a familiar, suffocating cocktail. It was a layered assault on the senses, a miasma composed of industrial bleach, the metallic tang of blood, and the sour, underlying note of human fear. Eleanor Vance moved through it like a fish through water, the environment so ingrained in her being that she barely registered its toxicity anymore. It was just air. It was just another Tuesday night, bleeding into a Wednesday morning at St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a weary, incessant hum, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed with every hurried movement of the staff. For 14 hours, she had been on her feet, a silent cog in a machine designed to cheat death, and the machine was grinding her down, one shift at a time. Her body ached with a deep, settled weariness that had long ago become her baseline state. It was in her bones, a permanent resident in the marrow. Her feet, encased in practical, comfortable shoes that had long since molded to their shape, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic pain. She was 52 years old, though the harsh lighting and the perpetual fatigue etched lines on her face that could have argued for 60. Her hair, once a warm chestnut, was now a salt and pepper gray, pulled back into a severe, functional bun that allowed no stray strands to escape. She was seen, when she was seen at all, as a fixture. Nurse Vance. Reliable. Old school. A piece of the hospital's aging infrastructure, as dependable and as unremarkable as the linoleum floors. Eleanor finished restocking the trauma bay, her movements economical and precise. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Each gauze packet was placed with its label facing out, each IV catheter sorted by gauge, each laryngoscope blade checked and clicked back into place. It was a ritual of control in a world defined by chaos. Her hands, though wrinkled and showing the first signs of arthritis, were steady and sure. They moved with a practiced grace that hinted at a long history of performing delicate, critical tasks under pressure. A younger nurse, Chloe, a bright-eyed and perpetually flustered recent graduate, fumbled with a new box of nitrile gloves, spilling them across the counter. Eleanor paused, scooped them up with one smooth motion, and refilled the dispenser without a word, offering the younger woman a small, tired smile that barely reached her eyes. Chloe flushed with gratitude. "Thanks, Eleanor." Eleanor just nodded, her gaze already drifting, scanning the entrance, the waiting room, the flow of bodies. It was a habit she could not break, an unconscious threat assessment of her surroundings. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, missed nothing. Dr. Alistair Finch swept into the bay, a whirlwind of self-importance and expensive cologne that momentarily overpowered the smell of antiseptic. He was the hospital's golden boy, a hotshot trauma surgeon with a photogenic smile, a tailored suit beneath his white coat, and an ego that required its own zip code. He exuded an aura of polished, unassailable authority, and he wielded it like a scalpel, often with just as much precision and just as little warmth. He glanced at the perfectly ordered trauma bay, his eyes flicking over Eleanor as if she were a piece of equipment. "Vance," he said, his tone clipped, not quite a greeting. "Did you recalibrate the arterial blood gas machine? It was giving me questionable readings on the last patient." His question was an accusation, a subtle assertion of his dominance by implying her failure. "I did, Dr. Finch," Eleanor replied, her voice low and even, betraying no emotion. "At the start of my shift, per protocol. I logged it in the maintenance records. It's likely the reagent cartridge needs replacing. I put in a work order with Biomed 2 hours ago." Her response was factual, concise, and utterly devoid of deference. She didn't cower or apologize. She simply stated the facts. This quiet, unshakable competence was what irritated Finch the most. He couldn't find fault in her work, so he found fault in her presence. She was a relic from a bygone era of nursing, a time before physicians were treated like deities. He preferred nurses like Chloe, who were nervous and eager to please, who looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear. Finch's lips thinned into a tight, displeased line. "See that it's handled," he commanded, before turning his attention to Chloe, his demeanor shifting instantly. He flashed a brilliant, condescending smile. "Chloe, darling, be a dear and fetch me the latest labs on the patient in bed 6. And try not to drop them this time." He winked, a gesture meant to be charming, but which landed with the subtlety of a lead weight. Chloe scurried away, her cheeks burning. Eleanor watched him go, her expression unchanging. She had worked with dozens of men like Alistair Finch over the years, in places far more dangerous than this sterile, brightly lit emergency room. Men who mistook arrogance for competence, who saw protocol not as a guide, but as a shield for their own inadequacies. They were predictable. And in her experience, predictable men were the first to break when things truly fell apart. She turned back to her work, the quiet rhythm of restocking a small anchor in the churning sea of the night. The calm was a fragile, temporary thing, a shallow breath before the plunge. It shattered just after 3 a.m., the piercing shriek of the ambulance siren sliced through the night, growing from a distant wail to a deafening roar as the vehicle reversed into the ambulance bay with a squeal of tortured tires. The radio crackled to life with a frantic report from the paramedics, the words tumbling over each other in a rush of adrenaline and urgency. "St. Jude's, this is Medic 1. We're inbound with a single male victim, late 50s, MVC rollover, high mechanism, GCS of 8, hypotensive, tachycardic, bilateral diminished breath sounds, significant blunt force trauma to the chest and abdomen. ETA, 60 seconds. The emergency department, which had been in a state of low-grade hum, instantly snapped to high alert. The energy shifted, becoming a palpable, crackling current. Dr. Finch strode to the center of the trauma bay, clapping his hands together like a director calling for action. "All right, people, let's look alive. Trauma team, assemble. Chloe, get 2 large-bore IVs ready. Vance, on airway. Let's move, let's move." He was in his element, the commander on his brightly lit battlefield, issuing orders and basking in the adrenaline. He thrived on the chaos, on the life-and-death drama that affirmed his importance. The automatic doors hissed open, and the paramedics burst through, pushing a gurney at a near run. The man on the stretcher was a brutalized landscape of flesh and blood. His face was a swollen purple mask, lacerated and almost unrecognizable. A thick cervical collar braced his neck. His chest was a mess of deep contusions, and a hastily applied dressing on his abdomen was already soaked through with dark, venous blood. He was intubated, a breathing tube snaking from his mouth, connected to an ambu bag that a paramedic was squeezing rhythmically. The monitors attached to him screamed a chorus of panicked, high-pitched beeps, painting a grim picture of a body in the final stages of rebellion against itself. "He was ejected from the vehicle," the lead paramedic shouted over the din, rattling off vitals and field interventions. "Blood pressure is 60/30 and dropping. We pushed 2 liters of saline wide open. No response." The team swarmed the gurney, a flurry of hands and voices. Finch was at the head of the bed, barking orders. "Get me a chest x-ray, stat! Type and cross for 6 units of O-neg. Let's get a central line in. I want a fast scan, now!" The well-rehearsed ballet of trauma care began. Clothes were cut away, lines were placed, sensors were attached. It was a symphony of controlled violence, an attempt to impose order on a body tearing itself apart from the inside. Eleanor moved to the patient's head as instructed, her hands taking over the ambu bag from the paramedic with practiced ease. Her gaze, however, was not on the airway. It was on the patient. She took in the whole picture, her mind processing data with a cold, detached efficiency that had been forged in far worse crucibles. While Finch focused on the obvious, catastrophic injuries, the crushed chest, the bleeding abdomen, Eleanor's eyes were drawn to the subtle, almost imperceptible signs that told a different, more insidious story. She saw the distended veins in the man's neck, bulging against the tight confines of the C-collar. She saw the faint, almost invisible, petechial hemorrhaging around his eyes. She noticed the slight, almost imperceptible shift of his trachea, pushed just a few millimeters off center. These were the whispers of a killer that the shouting of the major trauma was drowning out. Finch's approach was aggressive and by the book. He diagnosed a massive hemothorax, a chest cavity filling with blood, and prepared to insert a chest tube. "He's bleeding out in his chest," he declared, his voice booming with certainty. "That's why he's hypotensive." He grabbed a scalpel, ready to make the incision. The ultrasound technician confirmed fluid in the abdomen and chest. Finch nodded, his diagnosis seemingly confirmed. But the patient's vitals took another sharp dive. The rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor devolved into a frantic, chaotic shriek. He was going into ventricular fibrillation. "He's coding!" Chloe yelled, her voice trembling. "Paddles!" Finch commanded, abandoning the chest tube. "Charge to 200. The routine of resuscitation took over. Chest compressions began. The defibrillator whined as it charged, but Eleanor knew it was futile. They were treating the symptom, not the cause. They were trying to restart an engine that had been starved of fuel. Shocking him would do nothing. Eleanor saw it then, a complete and terrifying picture assembling itself in her mind from the disparate, subtle clues. It wasn't just blood in the chest. The mechanism of injury, the tracheal deviation, the neck veins. It wasn't a hemothorax, not primarily. It was something far rarer, far more lethal. Tension pneumopericardium. Air, forced by the trauma into the sac around the heart, was squeezing it to a standstill. Every beat was weaker than the last, unable to push blood against the suffocating pressure. The chest tube Finch had been about to insert would have done nothing. The defibrillator was a useless gesture. The man had perhaps 90 seconds of viable brain function left. She knew, with an icy certainty that settled deep in her gut, that they were about to lose him. She had seen this once before, not in a hospital, but in the dust and chaos of a Kandahar forward operating base. A soldier, caught in the overpressure of an IED blast, had presented with the same constellation of subtle, misleading symptoms. The field surgeon had missed it. The soldier had died on the table. Eleanor, then a senior medic whose rank and gender made her invisible to the arrogant surgeon, had watched, helpless. She had sworn to herself, over that soldier's cooling body, that she would never stand by and watch it happen again. That memory, buried for over a decade, now rose up with the force of a physical blow. She had to act. Protocol, hierarchy, the carefully constructed anonymity of her life, none of it mattered more than the life draining away on the table in front of her. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise of the failing resuscitation, calm, but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "Dr. Finch," she said, her tone level, "stop compressions. It's not a primary cardiac event. It's obstructive shock. He has a tension pneumopericardium." Finch, holding the charged defibrillator paddles, turned to her with a look of pure, unadulterated fury. His face, already flushed with adrenaline, darkened with rage. "What did you say?" he snarled, his voice low and menacing. "Are you countermanding my orders in the middle of a code? Get back on the bag, nurse. Now." The room fell silent, the only sounds the frantic beeping of the monitor and the hiss of the ventilator. Every eye was on the two of them, the star surgeon and the quiet, graying nurse. "There's no time," Eleanor stated, her voice unwavering. She was no longer addressing him as a subordinate. She was stating a tactical reality. "His heart is being crushed. The X-ray will be too late. The fast scan can't differentiate air from fluid reliably in this context. You need to decompress the pericardial sac immediately." Her words were precise, clinical, and utterly certain. She was not offering a suggestion. She was delivering a diagnosis. Finch's face was a mask of disbelief and wounded pride. For a nurse, an old nurse, to publicly challenge him in his own trauma bay was unthinkable. It was a professional and personal humiliation. "Security!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. "Get this woman out of my ER! She's fired! Vance, you are finished!" But Eleanor was no longer listening. She had already turned away from him, her mind and body moving in concert, driven by a decade of muscle memory she thought she had buried forever. She had made her choice. She had crossed the line. In the space of a heartbeat, the quiet, unassuming nurse vanished, replaced by something else entirely. Eleanor moved with a brutal, terrifying efficiency. Her motions were not those of a hospital nurse. They were the economical, purposeful movements of a soldier, an operator. She ignored the crash cart, knowing it wouldn't have what she needed. Instead, she spun towards a secondary supply cabinet, her mind's eye already picturing its contents. She pulled open a drawer, and her hand unerringly found what it was looking for: an 18-gauge, 3.5-inch angiocatheter, the kind used for deep central lines, but perfect for her purpose. She also grabbed a large, 60 cubic centimeter syringe. Chloe watched, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. It was as if a mask had been ripped away, revealing a completely different person underneath. The tired, quiet woman she knew was gone, and in her place was a figure of absolute, focused intensity. Eleanor was a predator, and the patient's impending death was her prey. She moved back to the bed, ignoring Finch's continued sputtering rage and the hesitant approach of a hospital security guard. She palmed the syringe and needle with a familiarity that spoke of thousands of repetitions in darkness and under fire. "Don't you dare touch my patient!" Finch screamed, finally moving to intercept her. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her bicep. It was a fatal mistake. Eleanor's reaction was instantaneous and reflexive. She didn't stop or struggle. In one fluid, seamless motion, she shifted her weight, dropped her center of gravity, and used his own momentum against him. A precisely applied twist of her wrist, targeting the radial nerve, sent a jolt of searing pain up his arm, forcing his grip to release involuntarily. A firm, open-palm shove to his chest sent him stumbling backward, his feet tangling, until he landed in a clumsy, undignified heap against a supply cart, scattering sterile dressings across the floor. The entire exchange took less than 2 seconds. It was not a brawl. It was a tactical restraint, executed with chilling precision. The security guard, who had been moving in, froze in his tracks, his hand hovering near his sidearm, suddenly and acutely aware that he was completely out of his depth. The trauma bay was now utterly silent, save for the death rattle of the cardiac monitor. Eleanor paid them no mind. She was in the zone, a state of hyper-focused clarity where the world narrowed to the patient, the needle, and the mission. She leaned over the man, her left hand palpating his chest, not where a textbook would indicate, but in a slightly different location. She was searching for the 5th intercostal space, just to the left of the sternum. It was the peristernal approach, a dangerous and unorthodox technique taught only in the most advanced combat medicine courses. It was faster and more effective than the standard subxiphoid approach, but carried a higher risk of puncturing a lung or the heart itself. It required absolute confidence and a surgeon's hand. "You're insane! You'll kill him!" Finch gasped from the floor, clutching his wrist. But his words were hollow, lost in the charged atmosphere of the room. Eleanor located the spot. She tilted the needle at a precise 45-degree angle, aiming medially toward the heart. With a firm, controlled push, she advanced the needle through skin, muscle, and cartilage. There was a distinct pop as the needle pierced the pericardial sac. She had done this before, in the back of a shaking helicopter, with sand and blood flying, guided only by touch and instinct. She attached the syringe and began to pull back on the plunger. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, the syringe filled not with blood, but with frothy, pinkish fluid and a rush of air. A gasp went through the room. She had been right. The effect was immediate and dramatic. On the monitor, the chaotic, jagged line of ventricular fibrillation instantly converted into a weak but organized rhythm. A single, beautiful beep echoed in the silent room. Then another. Tachycardic, yes, but it was a beat. A real, life-sustaining beat. The patient's blood pressure, which had been flatlining, flickered on the screen. 70/40. Then 80/50. The suffocating pressure on his heart was released. Eleanor held the catheter steady with one hand while she worked the syringe, drawing out more air, her face a mask of intense concentration. The engine had been restarted. The fuel was flowing again. The man on the table took a shuddering, ventilator-assisted breath. He was alive. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. Dr. Finch, still on the floor, stared with wide, uncomprehending eyes, his professional world shattered in the space of 30 seconds. Chloe looked from the miraculously stabilizing monitor to Eleanor, her expression one of pure, unadulterated reverence. The security guard slowly lowered his hand, looking at Eleanor as if she had just sprouted wings. He had come to restrain a hysterical nurse. He had instead witnessed a miracle of brutal, baffling competence. The air, which moments before had tasted of death, now fizzed with life and disbelief. Into this tableau of stunned silence, a new sound intruded. A low, guttural groan from the patient. His eyes, which had been fixed and dilated, fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain and sedatives, but they were focused. They scanned the room, bypassing the doctors and nurses, and locked onto Eleanor. His hand, shaking with effort, lifted from the gurney, and his fingers brushed against her forearm. His grip was surprisingly strong. Eleanor looked down, her concentration broken for the first time. The man's lips moved, forming a word, a single, raspy syllable that cut through the clinical hum of the machines. Wraith? The name hung in the air, an impossible, alien word in the sterile environment of the emergency room. It was a ghost, a name from another life, a life Eleanor had buried under years of quiet anonymity and exhaustion. Her blood ran cold. The carefully constructed walls around her past, the fortress she had built to keep the memories at bay, crumbled to dust in an instant. She looked into the patient's eyes and saw a flicker of recognition, of shared history in a world of dust and violence that no one here could possibly comprehend. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her face, for a fleeting moment, was an open book of shock and sorrow. Finch finally scrambled to his feet, his face a mottled patchwork of crimson and pale white. Humiliation warred with fury. The patient was alive, yes, but his authority had been irrevocably undermined, his incompetence laid bare in front of his entire team. He zeroed in on the only thing he could control. "I don't care what you did," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You assaulted a superior. You performed a procedure you are not licensed for. You are a danger to this hospital. Security, I want her out of here. Now. I'll have her license revoked by morning." This time, the security guard complied, albeit hesitantly. He stepped forward, his expression apologetic. "Ma'am, you have to come with me." Eleanor slowly straightened up, her hand gently detaching from the patient's grasp. The operator retreated, and the tired, gray nurse returned, her shoulders slumping almost imperceptibly. She had completed the mission. The cost was yet to be calculated, but it would be high. She looked at the patient one last time, a silent promise passing between them. Then she turned and faced the guard. She offered no resistance. She simply nodded, her face a blank, unreadable mask. She surrendered her hospital ID badge into his outstretched hand and allowed him to escort her from the trauma bay, leaving behind a scene of impossible survival, a disgraced doctor, and a team of medical professionals staring after her as if they had just seen a ghost. The walk to the hospital administrator's office felt like the longest of her life. The fluorescent lights of the corridor seemed to hum with accusation. The dawn was breaking outside, painting the windows with streaks of gray and pale pink. A new day was beginning, and with it, the end of her career. The administrator, a man named Henderson, whose face was perpetually etched with the worry of budgets and lawsuits, sat behind a large mahogany desk. Dr. Finch was already there, pacing back and forth, his arm in a ridiculously oversized sling he had clearly applied himself for dramatic effect. He was recounting his version of events, a lurid tale of an unhinged, insubordinate nurse who had gone berserk and assaulted him. Henderson listened, his expression grim. He was a bureaucrat, a man who lived and died by the holy trinity of protocol, liability, and insurance. The story Finch was weaving was a nightmare scenario. "She physically attacked me!" Finch insisted, his voice rising with theatrical indignation, and then performed a wildly dangerous, unsanctioned procedure. It's a miracle the patient survived her reckless actions. Henderson held up a hand to silence him as Eleanor was shown into the office. He looked at her, his eyes cold and distant. "Nurse Vance," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I have heard Dr. Finch's report. Insubordination, physical assault on a senior physician, performing a medical procedure far outside your scope of practice. The hospital's liability in this matter is astronomical. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Eleanor stood before the desk, her back straight, her hands clasped loosely behind her. She was tired, so deeply tired. She could fight it. She could explain the medical necessity, the certainty of the diagnosis. But she knew it would be useless. They weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in damage control. They saw a lawsuit, not a life saved. "The patient was in cardiac arrest from a tension pneumopericardium," she said, her voice flat. "Standard resuscitation was failing. The procedure was necessary to save his life." "That is for a doctor to determine, not a nurse," Finch snapped. Henderson sighed, rubbing his temples. "Eleanor, your employment at St. Jude's is terminated, effective immediately. We will be reporting this incident to the state nursing board. I suggest you retain legal counsel." He pushed a single sheet of paper across the desk, her termination notice. It was that simple. A decade of service, erased with a signature. Eleanor picked up the paper, folded it neatly, and placed it in her pocket. She gave them a single, long look. A look that contained no anger, no fear, only a profound and weary disappointment. Then she turned and walked out of the office, the door clicking shut behind her, sealing her fate. She walked out of the hospital and into the cool, clean air of the morning. The sun was just beginning to crest the horizon, bathing the city in a soft, golden light. It felt strange to be outside, to be free from the recycled air and the constant hum of machinery. She felt nothing. Just a vast, empty quiet where her career used to be. She started the walk to the bus stop, her mind a blank slate. What would she do now? Where would she go? The life she had so carefully built, the quiet penance for the sins of her past, was gone. It was then that she heard it. A low, rhythmic thumping, a sound that bypassed her ears and resonated deep in her chest, in her very bones. It was a sound from her other life, a sound that meant either rescue or ruin. She stopped, looking up at the sky. The thumping grew louder, closer, a percussive, world-beating chop, chop, chop that vibrated through the pavement. A helicopter. But it wasn't the red and white of a medical transport. This was a flat, menacing black. A Sikorsky UH-60 Blackhawk. It wasn't heading for the designated helipad on the roof of the ER. It was making a beeline for the main administrative building, the one she had just exited. It swooped low, its rotor wash whipping trees and kicking up dust from the street. With a terrifying precision that spoke of elite pilots, it settled onto the flat roof of the building, its landing gear compressing with a heavy thud. Before the massive rotors had even begun to slow, the side doors slid open and figures began to deploy. They were not hospital staff. They were men in dark, impeccably tailored suits with earpieces, and others in immaculate military dress uniforms. They moved with the same fluid, predatory grace that Eleanor herself had displayed just hours earlier. They fanned out, securing the rooftop, their movements sharp and practiced. A knot of hospital security guards emerged onto the roof, looking confused and utterly intimidated. One of the men in suits, clearly the one in charge, spoke briefly to the head of security, who immediately backed away, his face pale. Inside the administrator's office, the roar of the helicopter and the vibration shaking the building had brought Henderson and Finch to the window. They stared in disbelief as the soldiers and suited agents stormed through the rooftop access door and began heading down the stairs. A few moments later, the door to Henderson's office burst open without a knock. The man in the lead suit stepped in, his eyes sweeping the room with a cold, analytical gaze. He was flanked by a man in the uniform of a United States Army general, his chest a formidable array of ribbons and medals. "Who the hell are you?" Henderson stammered, rising from his chair. This is a private office. The lead agent ignored him completely. His eyes fell on Dr. Finch, who was still preening in his sling. Are you Dr. Alistair Finch? The agent asked, his voice calm but laced with steel. Yes, Finch said, puffing out his chest, assuming this was somehow about him, a recognition of his importance. The agent's gaze was withering. You are to be detained for questioning regarding medical negligence and the endangerment of a person of significant national security interest. Two other agents stepped forward and flanked a stunned Finch, their hands resting lightly on his arms. The general then stepped forward, his eyes locking onto the administrator. I am General Marcus Thorne, he said, his voice a low rumble of command. The man you almost allowed to die in your emergency room this morning is Senator David Thompson, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Henderson's face went ashen. Senator Thompson has regained consciousness, the general continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more menacing. And he has made two things very clear. The first is that Dr. Finch's incompetence nearly cost him his life. The second is that he is alive because of the actions of one of your nurses. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. We are here for her. Where is Eleanor Vance? The full, crushing weight of the situation finally dawned on Henderson and the now terrified Finch. They had not just fired a nurse, they had fired the savior of one of the most powerful men in the country. Henderson began to stammer, to backtrack, to explain. There's been a misunderstanding, a procedural issue. But General Thorne cut him off with a slice of his hand. There is no misunderstanding. A specialist was flown in from Walter Reed an hour ago. He has confirmed her diagnosis. Tension pneumopericardium, secondary to a blast wave injury pattern from the crash dynamics. He also confirmed that the procedure she performed, a peristernal needle decompression, was the only thing that could have saved his life. A procedure, I might add, that is not taught in any civilian medical school. The general took a step closer, his eyes boring into Finch. It is, however, the standard field treatment for that specific injury in certain special operations units. It's a technique detailed extensively in the Tier 1 Combat Trauma Manual. He leaned in, his voice a whisper of pure venom. A manual that was written 15 years ago by the woman you just fired. The last vestiges of color drained from Finch's face. He looked as if he had been physically struck. He was no longer a star surgeon. He was a fraud, exposed in the most brutal and public way imaginable. General Thorne straightened up, his attention now fixed on the hospital administrator. You see, Mr. Henderson, you've made a grave error. You think you fired a nurse, but what you actually did was terminate the employment of retired Master Sergeant Eleanor Vance, call sign Wraith. For 6 years, she was the lead medic for a JSOC ghost unit that officially doesn't exist. She has more confirmed saves in active combat zones than any other medic in the history of the Special Operations Command. The Senator knows her because she pulled him out of a burning vehicle in Iraq 12 years ago. He let the information hang in the air, a stunning, world-altering revelation. She is a legend. And you, he said, his voice dripping with contempt, tried to have her license revoked. The agents led the now catatonic Finch from the room. His career wasn't just over, it was annihilated. Investigations would follow, lawsuits, public disgrace. He was finished. General Thorne looked at Henderson, whose face was slick with sweat. Your hospital is now under federal investigation. I suggest you find a very, very good lawyer. The general then turned and left the office, leaving Henderson to collapse into his chair, the ruins of his well-ordered world crumbling around him. The general and his team found Eleanor at the bus stop, sitting quietly on the bench, watching the city wake up. The Black Hawk was still on the roof, a dark predator waiting for its charge. The general approached her alone, his footsteps slow and respectful. Eleanor, he said softly. She looked up, her face betraying no surprise. Marcus, she replied, her voice husky. It's been a long time. He nodded, a sad smile touching his lips. Too long. I'm sorry it took something like this. He gestured back towards the hospital. The senator is stable. He's asking for you. He trusts you. He wants you to oversee his recovery. personally. Right here, or we can move him to Walter Reed. Your call. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, the morning sun warming her face. She had run from that world, from the responsibility, from the ghosts. But it seemed that world had finally caught up to her. And after that? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The general's smile widened slightly. After that, the old offer is back on the table. The White House Medical Unit. They've been trying to recruit you since you retired. This time, it's not a request. It's a blank check. Name your position, name your terms. The president has already signed off on it. It was more than a job offer. It was a restoration, a recognition of who and what she truly was. Later that day, Eleanor stood in the quiet, sunlit ICU room. The cacophony of the ER had been replaced by the gentle, rhythmic sigh of a ventilator and the steady beep of a cardiac monitor. Senator Thompson was awake, the sedation lessened. He was weak, but his eyes were clear. He watched her as she checked his IV lines, her movements once again calm, competent, and reassuring. Chloe, the young nurse from the ER, entered the room to hang a new bag of antibiotics. She didn't speak to Eleanor, but her eyes held a look of profound, almost fearful respect. She was in the presence of something she was only just beginning to understand. When Chloe left, the senator spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Knew it was you," he rasped, a faint smile playing on his bruised lips. "I'd recognize those hands anywhere. The hands that pull you back from the edge." Eleanor paused, looking at him, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed a genuine smile to touch her own face. It was a small, tired smile, but it was real. A shared, unspoken understanding passed between them, the silent bond of survivors, of two people who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and had, against all odds, emerged on the other side. She finished her checks and moved to the window, looking out over the sprawling city below. For so long, she had tried to be invisible, to find peace in the quiet, thankless work of a civilian nurse. She had believed she could escape the battlefield, that she could leave the operator, the wraith, buried in the sands of a faraway desert. But she understood now. The battlefield was everywhere. The war against chaos, against entropy, against death itself, was fought not just with guns and dusty streets, but with needles and knowledge, in the quiet, sterile rooms of a hospital. True heroes didn't always wear uniforms or carry rifles. Sometimes they wore scrubs. And an operator never truly retires. They just find a new war to fight.